Thank you, everybody. I have this distinct honor and privilege today to introduce to us in the House the keynote speaker of this conference. Jim, as we know him, Anglin, has a PhD, a BA in philosophy and social work, but he is a child and youth care worker. Jim Anglin began his career as a child and youth care worker in a mental health center in Vancouver, and later moved to Victoria and began a 6-bed group home for 4 boys and 2 girls who were experiencing a variety of distresses in their lives. Following these frontline work experiences, he pursued graduate studies and then spent 2 years in social work policy in Ottawa and 2 years as a senior project coordinator with the Children's Services Division in Toronto. He returned to British Columbia in 1979 and joined the faculty of the School of Child and Youth Care at the University of Victoria, where he is a full professor and former director. His recent research interests have focused on a reappreciation of residential care for children and youth. He has published in North American journals and international text on a variety of child and youth care issues, in addition to residential care, including professionalization, quality assurance and standards, parent education and support, and international initiatives. He is on the editorial boards of the Child and Youth Care Forum, Child and Youth Care Services, and Reclaiming Youth at Risk. He was coordinating editor for the text Perspectives in Professional Child and Youth Care. Now, over 20 years, he has presented papers, keynote addresses, and workshops in over 40 countries. He has served as a liaison with the Canada FITSE since 1986. Jim has had and still has a relationship with the NACCW since the early 90s. He is more than a friend. He was instrumental in the relationship with the NACCW and what the NACCW now has with FITSE International and the establishment of FITSE in Southern Africa. Please help me and join me in welcoming to the podium our keynote speaker, Professor Jim Anglin.
Wow. Those of you who are here for your first time can perhaps imagine how challenging it is to follow what has happened so far here today and some of the greatest leadership in this world. Sanabonani, Molaweni, Dumelong. Hello. Ninjani. Meshobadala. I think that's about it. Perhaps buy a donkey. What an incredible gathering this is. What a venue for the 40th anniversary. I can't help but reflect back to my first visit 21 years ago. And it was in the first few months after the first democratic elections. And there was still a honeymoon period in this country. The new South Africa was emerging, and even the most hardened, struggle-weary journalists, cynical people were saying, this is a miracle. You remember that? The miracle. of those elections. I believe when I first arrived, NACCW had 7 staff members. I understand that there are over 300 staff members now throughout this country. I don't think even the greatest visionaries like our chairpersons and the directors in those days could have possibly imagined what was going to evolve and what's happened in particularly the last 5 to 10 years. You never forget Don Matera, and not only his words, but the voice stays with you. It's difficult to even acknowledge what he means to this country. And to those of us who get to know him. When you say this is God's organization, doing God's work, we carry that in our hearts. When I first arrived, this country was just emerging from being an international outcast. Sometimes people I would meet would say, we need to hear from someone from a normal country. Talk to us about childcare in Canada. And there was an implication that somehow Canada had developed a model to be imitated or to be learned from. That was not true then, and it's not true now. In fact, when we Canadians visited the District 6 Museum last evening, those of us from Canada were feeling the shame and burden of our own legacy, of forced removals of Aboriginal people onto reserves, the Canadian version of the apartheid settlements and homelands. But not only did we displace communities, we removed over 150,000 children from their families over an 80-year period and placed them in residential schools, far from their parents and communities. Why did we do this? To take the Indian out of the child and to assimilate them to white mainstream society. And of course, Indian is not a term we use any longer. A fellow named Christopher Columbus landed in America and thought he was in India. I think his GPS system was not working at that point. And it's also interesting to notice that Columbus sailed west to discover a new route to the east. And those of us in government would say that was a typical government project, right? But just 4 weeks ago, the final report of our own Truth and Reconciliation Commission was released. The judge chairing the commission, who is an Indigenous person, as well as our Chief Justice of our Supreme Court, have labeled the residential schools as a case of cultural genocide. I say this to you now because I want you to know that those of us from Canada are still in the early stages of our own truth and reconciliation process, and that the stories of District 6 and Sophiatown, which Don writes about so eloquently, have their shameful counterpart in our country. There are deep wounds to heal and much work to be done to free the children of today from these historic legacies. The field of child and youth care is necessarily a part of the broader societies in which we live, and it is flooded with pain, prejudice, and the effects of traumas. To work in child and youth care is to experience a roller coaster of emotions. At one moment, we can be gripped by pain and despair, and at the next, swept up in joy and celebration. We learn to roll with it, knowing that all things will pass and that time carries us inexorably forward. When I was contacted about presenting here today, a truly great honor and a humbling one, I must add, I was asked to talk about the nature of the child and youth care as a profession, and to do so within an historical and cultural and international context, and also in terms of some of the impacts that child and youth care has had in the lives of children and families and communities. In what I will say this morning, I want to emphasize the progress that has been made and the innovations that are now emerging. But I felt we first needed to acknowledge the pain of the past that still pervades our countries and many other countries and makes our ways of working so very important and relevant. So I need to start the slide presentation. All right, good, that's working. I had a bit of a panic when they tried to load my memory stick, it wouldn't load, and I thought, oh my gosh, what do I do without my overheads? So the first thing we need to do is to celebrate the 40 years, which we have been doing very well. The evolution of professional child and youth care, just a few words about that. Some things about the international scope that I've learned over the last 30 to 40 years. The child and youth care, well, I need to keep going here. It's my responsibility, I suddenly realized. Stop being so helpless, right? The child and youth care difference, how we do what we do. A little bit about the impact of child and youth care and some of the emerging evidence about that. And finally, a few takeaway messages. There we go. I've caught up with myself now. You may be familiar with this sign from television, movies, photographs. And I was thinking about that, and it led me to think about this. Why couldn't we build a sign on the side of Table Mountain? Please, City Council of Cape Town, just for a week, can we put up a little sign, NACCW, celebrating the 40th years, and a few fireworks, whoops. I think the answer was no. And a few fireworks just to top off that beautiful mountain. So, celebrating NACCW, just starting counterclockwise, the upper left-hand corner. One of the amazing things that Ernie did from the very start was to develop training programs, to develop certificates, to support the workers, to start lecturing on burnout and how to avoid it. And now we have thousands of accredited child and youth care workers in South Africa. Don Matera symbolizes the leadership of this organization and this country and the amazing people that have contributed to the NACCW. The Child and Youth Care Journal, which, as Tom Garfat said, is the best professional journal in the world for an association, bar none. And that has been coming out. I read the early issues just over the last month or so. And everything that you see today started with Brian Gannon and his vision and Ernie building a solid organization. And then, of course, the biennial conferences, which were there from the very start. 20 biennial conferences. FITSE South Africa has formed and is now a leading part of the international community of child and youth care work. And I'm not exaggerating. That's one reason we have 70 people here from other countries. That is now being recognized. The Isabindi projects, the innovation that NACCW has done in so many different projects through the transformation of the child and youth care system. The workers who care for the children and provide alternate homes for them, give them a place to begin to grow and to develop and deal with the pain that they have. And of course, the recognition that has now come for this work, both within Africa and, within South Africa and across the entire continent. The Larissa Award recognizing that Isabindi is one of the great social innovations in all of Africa. Let's have a round of applause for the NACCW. Okay, just a couple of words about the evolution of professional helping. The notion of a profession evolves, of course, from professing one's faith. A professor is somebody who professes. But it's evolved, of course, into a secular definition, and now you don't want to have anybody but a professional car washer do your car, and you want to have a professional dog walker, and you want to have a professional accountant, and you want to have a professional window washer. So it really has changed somewhat in its meaning. But it's interesting to see that psychology emerged about 125 years ago. Modern social work, I realize I can see myself down here. Psychology and psychiatry social work and psychiatry emerged about 100 years ago, and child and youth care about 70 years ago. The modern version, I could get into going back almost 2,000 years, as some of us in this room have been thinking about, but modern child and youth care emerged about 70 years ago. Now, when I was thinking about this is just 3 generations. My grandfather was born and grew up as psychology was emerging. My father was born and grew up as social work and psychiatry were emerging. I was born and grew up as child and youth care was emerging. That's just 3 generations. Out of the thousands or millions of years that human beings have been around, this is so new, what we're doing. Not just child and youth care work, but the others, the other professions. So where will child and youth care be in another 30 or 50 years? Child and youth care is just now emerging in parts of Africa, Asia, China, East Asia, India, and the Middle East. We can anticipate significant growth in the number of countries in global child and youth care, the number of formal education programs, and the number of child and youth care workers worldwide. China and India alone have almost 40% of the world population, and they're just beginning to wake up to the profession of child and youth care, just in few little places. But wait till that catches fire. The population across the 53 African countries is predicted to grow faster than anywhere else. This is a quote from the UNICEF Generation 2030 report released last year in Johannesburg. Africa will be home to 2 in 5 children by 2050. That's not that far away. The future of humanity, the report goes on, is increasingly African. In 1950, Africa accounted for only 9% of the world population. But by the end of this century, about 40% of all humans and nearly half of all children will be African. What about the scope of child and youth care? Over 40 countries have professional child and youth care at some stage of development. In many European countries and in North America, it's very well established and still growing, of course, greatly. And other countries are in the early stages, such as, say, Zambia or Kenya. Many other countries, Brazil, Japan, are beginning to discover child and youth care. And about 2/3 of the countries have formal child and youth care post-secondary education. And I know we have a fair number of people teaching in different post-secondary institutions around the world here today. Canada, for example, has about 50 college programs and 8 university programs. There's always a little bit of discussion about some programs being hybrids with child and youth studies. But we have about 8 programs that identify as producing child and youth care workers as one of their primary tasks. And in Quebec, we have many psychoeducator programs which developed on the basis of the French educateur model. So that's the world situation. But the UNICEF's Generation 2030 report goes on to say 18 million out of the 53 million in South Africa are under 18 years of age. In Canada, out of 36 million, 8.6 million are children and youth. So, by comparison, if we just go by the numbers of children, South Africa needs about 100 college programs and 18 university programs right now. So those of you in education, there's a lot of work to do. But why do we need educational programs for child and youth care anyway? Well, there are lots of reasons, but I think one is because it does attract people who are crazy about kids. I mean, look at this room today. I mean, these little children walk by and everybody's... Dawn and I are falling over, just looking in the eyes of this little girl standing in front of us, and we were mesmerized. I mean, there's some people who are just crazy about kids. And it was Yuri Bronfenbrenner who said that every child needs at least one adult who is irrationally attached to them. And irrationally attached to them means they're crazy about them. We also need people who want to devote their careers and even their lives to the well-being of children. And we need programs because orphaned and vulnerable children need skilled and knowledgeable and informed adults who will always keep their eye on the child and advocate for their best interests. Just a quick little story. Keeping the eyes on the child may sound trivial, may sound very mundane. We had a situation not many years ago in British Columbia where a young child died of starvation, and there were 5 professionals involved with the family. How does that happen? How it happens is they took their eyes off the child. There was no child care worker involved. The other professions dealt with the parents. When somebody came to the house, the mother would say, "I'm sorry, the child's sleeping, we don't want to disturb him. The child's not feeling well today, missed doctor's appointments, he had to do something else." This child died in the system. And when I say our child and youth care system has not been working well, there's a long way to go. We need people who will never take their eyes off the child. You do not visit a family and not see the child. So this leads to a professional approach that is child-focused and keeps the child's interest at the center, as we've heard many times already this morning. It also leads to unique research, publications, and innovative practices. So, for example, the child and youth care journals around the world now, including the South African one. The student projects and theses that are being done. And congratulations, Dr. Lasiba, wherever you're sitting. One of the early PhDs in child and youth care in South Africa. Life space interventions that are being created. And Isabindi. Isabindi could not have been created by any other profession. Could it? No other profession wants to work evenings, weekends, and holidays. As a start. So, how child and youth care workers make a difference is different from different professions' differences. Because all helping professions seek to make a difference in different ways. Right? I don't need to repeat that, do I? It would be fun, but I won't. While we have mutual learning and increasing convergence of values and principles across the professions, we also have a range of professions because there are many different roles that need to be played within our service system for children and families. And I want to just mention the Global Alliance, which you'll hear a lot more about for the social service workforce. So the NACCW has been working very closely in helping the Global Alliance to understand more about the profession of child and youth care and its role within the human service system. And there will be a webcast, the first global child and youth care webcast in history, happening here on Thursday afternoon, right? So don't miss that. It'll be another historic moment. So a document that's been produced has been trying to identify the principles, functions, and competencies for social service professions. And the document recognizes and acknowledges both the broad common principles and the common, the common functions across professions. And this is a bit of a subtle point, and I'm speaking for a moment particularly to those professions who are other than child and youth care for a moment. We do share a lot, and we do share functions such as communications, interpersonal communication. We share relating to families. We share assessment responsibilities. We share evaluation. There are a whole number of functions that we share across the professions. But at the same time, the competencies that the Global Alliance have developed recognize the unique body of knowledge within each profession, which derives from its unique history, literature, practice, wisdom, research, and context. So just a little bit about the unique context of child and youth care. We've heard about the term life space, and it is at the core, I think, of how we work with children, youth, and families. Each of the human service functions has been assessed by the Global Alliance and articulated in terms of the appropriate life space interactions that child and youth care workers do. So, for example, when we work with a family, we often work in the life space dealing with very basic day-to-day needs of families, whether it's an elder child learning to cook for the younger siblings, how to do laundry, how to do a budget, all of those kinds of things. That's how we work with families, is in their life space where they live. Other professions tend to work much more on a session basis or in an office-based setting or school-based or something like that. So it takes a while to unpack what it is that child and youth care workers do in those settings. Now, another interesting project, which I just wanted to mention, this is for the Scottish folks in the hall. Powerful ideas and concepts are at the heart of what we do and are central to our identity as child and youth care workers. And the Scottish, you can't read this, but it's not important you read the details because I'm going to pull some highlights out. But some clever people who many of us know in this auditorium, Laura Steckley and a fellow named Graham McFeet, have developed a project to try and unpack, to try and find from the field what the core concepts are. And they're using the term threshold concepts, which simply means these are powerful and central to the nature of what we do. So they asked experts, and I was one of the people consulted in a conference call, and many of you here today, I think, were also in that process. So they asked the experts and the educators what they thought the powerful concepts were. And I've circled some of them. The bigger the box, the more people use that term. So you find terms like use of self, care, child development, relational practice, containment, life space. And then they went and asked the students. They gave the students much prettier colors. Students and practitioners, what they thought the core concepts were. So you get a sense of what's filtering through from the educators and in the dialogue between the two. And again, the largest boxes have words like care, therapeutic care, life space, self, relationship, containment, child development. So this reminded me of a very famous South African concept called the Big Five. Now, those of you who are new to South Africa, the Big Five are the 5 animals most difficult to hunt on foot. So can you imagine facing any of these 5 by yourself with a little pellet gun or something? Some of you are going to Kruger Park and you're going to go on walks. Make sure the fellow has a big gun with him. So we've got the Cape buffalo and the African elephant and the rhinoceros, white and black, the leopard, and the lion. And if you're lucky, you may even have the full set in your pocket right now. Or at least a few of them. So South African has recognized them so centrally, threshold animals in the country, that they're on the money. So this made me think of what's the Big Five in child and youth care. And given those two diagrams, I thought that they indicated child development, self, relationship, life space, and care. Those are all central to what we do in child and youth care. However, as I thought about it, I really thought it should be the Big Six, because those animals don't exist without being in a nurturing environment. The context is important. So when I mentioned this actually Merle said, you know, you got the Big Six there. And I said, yeah, but there's only 5 animals. He said, but some people consider the right whale to be the Big Six, to be the 6th one. And I certainly think it fits the criterion of being difficult to hunt on foot. So the environment I've labeled as the 6th of the Big Six. So in a nutshell, and I over my last 25 years have spent a lot of time trying to define the essence of child and youth care. And in the webcast, what Zenny has asked me to do is to start off with a definition of child and youth care that could perhaps provide a context for some of the other discussion. What I tried to do for today is to reduce that even further. And it occurs to me, having studied philosophy for a number of years, that I like concepts, and you can actually try and define anything in one word, one sentence, one paragraph, one page, one article, one book, or one career. There are people in our field whose careers really define child and youth work because of all they have done. So what I tried to do today is to come up with one sentence. If it was one word, it would probably be relationship. Life Space would be fighting for that status as well. So what I'm suggesting could be a one-sentence definition would be how we share ourselves in care interactions, in the life space of young people and families, to create transformative developmental and therapeutic experiences. So I'll just take a moment to unpack that. How we work has a lot to do with space and time. Child and youth care workers occupy in the lives of children and families intimate spaces. That's quite different from other professions, and often over extended periods of time. Often hours at a stretch. When I first started in my group home, I worked 100-hour shifts. It wouldn't be allowed today, but I learned so much from having to live with children for 4.5 days without a break. The first rule is there's no physical force by anybody in this home, because 2 of the young men could have taken me in a fight any day. So you learn how to survive with your relationship skills in that environment. Sharing significant portions of everyday life is part of what we can call the child and youth care difference. And I think we have to get better at articulating that for people, because it's not intuitively obvious what child and youth care workers do. Most people think it's babysitting or it's nannying. It's just hanging out. It's being a custodian. And we know that it is far more than that. But it's on our responsibility to define that. And one of the defining books in North America was The Other 23 Hours. I don't know how many people are taught anything about this in South Africa. Have you heard about The Other 23 Hours? How many? Yeah? Okay, quite a few of you. That book was written in response to a book called The 50-Minute Hour. A psychologist, psychiatrist had wrote a book about the importance of the 50-minute therapeutic session with people with mental illness, mental challenges. And Albert Treichman was quite a unique psychiatrist who worked in residential care, and he had 2 graduate students working with him named Jim Whitaker and Larry Brentrow. And some of you may have heard of Larry, if not Jim, because Larry's been here a number of times. They were both graduate students, and they roomed together as graduate students at university. I had the delightful experience. Where's James Freeman? Are you here somewhere? James and I were at a conference. There you are. We're at a conference in Savannah, Georgia, and Jim Whitaker and Larry Brentrow were there presenting, and I had the pleasure of having dinner with them one night while they were tracing back when was the first moment that The Other 23 Hours was discovered. And you want to know what it was? It was at a conference like this in Cleveland in 1968. It was called the Orthopsychiatry Conference, and they always had lots of child and youth care involvement in those days. And the 3 of them sat around and said, we really have to articulate the other 23 hours. Yes, the therapy hour is important, but the other 23 hours are maybe even more important. So it's interesting to go back in history. I would hope that tonight, with your 100 Rand voucher, that you might find a nice place to have dinner, and 2 or 3 of you in this room may well come up with the next version of The Other 23 Hours. That's how it was invented, talking over dinner at a conference. You can't stop working just because you go to the waterfront. So let's begin with the sharing self aspect of this definition, this one-sentence definition. We sometimes talk about the use of self, but I think a lot of us also know that we go beyond use of self, which most helping professions use, into the sharing of self. And this sharing of self is part of the demanding nature of our work. how does one share oneself in a professional way, in a compassionate way, but still drawing appropriate boundaries in terms of our role? We're not there to be friends with the children. We're there to help the children. We can be friendly with the children, but we should not forget that we have a role that is very purposive and intentional. So we're required to bring our whole selves, but at the same time, to draw some boundaries around what and how we can do things. And the difference is important, and it has real implications for how young people respond to us. And we all have stories who've worked in the field for a few years. Some of these were shared at the Residential Care Day yesterday. That was a great day. Those of us from abroad who spent the day with you were re-energized about residential care because it's often undervalued and misunderstood. And just how we relate to children in those milieux actually make a huge difference. And so here in these photographs, just sitting by a campfire with children, talking, sitting on the ground, reading to children at their level, in a family where we're helping them change diapers, make meals, clean up the house. Those are therapeutic moments. Many other people who have not done childcare would not understand that. Care interactions can also be understood as care relationships. And the term care interactions came from the late, great Dr. Henry Mayer. And there's a photograph of him there. And there's a photograph of him meddling. He used to say in training, he would look at you and say, "Do you mind if I meddle?" And then the blood would rush out of your head because you knew you were going to be nailed. And somehow what you knew or what you didn't know was going to be exposed to everybody around you. But he always did it in a learning way, in a supportive way, but a challenging way at the same time. And so many of you in this room, I know from abroad, knew Henry Mayer. And he coined the term because so often the literature talked about caretaking or caregiving. And when you think about those terms, those are one way. And he was saying child and youth care is always reciprocal. Care interactions are what we're involved in. And what about the ever-present word care? 70 years of child and youth care literature about the nature of care clarifies that it's not for us caring about or caring for children. It's caring with children, engaging with children, engaging them with purpose in all of its messiness, sadness, joy, and chaos. And I mention here, there is no dirty work in child and youth care. It's all care work. And the reason I put that note in there was an article was reprinted 2 issues ago, if you read your Child and Youth Work magazine, by Wilma Thomas it was. And she said that as professions grow and develop, they divest themselves of their dirty work. And I thought, yeah, not child and youth care. Because those moments that other people would consider menial are actually also therapeutic. In fact, sometimes the most therapeutic moments. Driving in a car to a doctor's appointment with a child. Some people say, well, that's a waste of a professional's time to be driving a car. Well, what can happen sitting side by side to a child in a car often is very different from what happens face to face. So child care workers learn that actually driving shopping or driving to a medical appointment is a time where children will often open up with you. There's something about sitting side by side. How would you know that if you didn't experience it, right? So these are the ways that we work, and we need to get better and better at articulating those therapeutic moments with children. There is no dirty work. And we interact in a care mode in the child's life space. And again, at the Residential Care Day yesterday, that whole notion of life space came up again. And people saying, you know, I'm not sure we really understand that yet. And I don't think as a field we do. It's such a powerful, complex concept that I really don't think we've given it yet enough attention. So those of you at DUT, here's an assignment for you. Explore life space and help us articulate it. But I think at this point we can say life space is the combination of all factors that influence a person's behavior at a given moment in time. It includes a person's present thoughts, memories, needs, motives, personality, as well as aspects of the external environment. So there's an internal aspect of life space and the external aspect of life space. So especially in the environment, the other people to whom the child looks to for safety, care, and guidance. And I think that an important part of the child and youth care difference is the fact that we often are the person most present in the child's life space. This means that we have both the opportunity and the responsibility to spend our time thoughtfully and in the best interest of children in order to create developmental and therapeutic experiences. Now, I know in training this is being taught. I hear it in the Isabindi videos. I hear it in talking to people that they get this. We have to articulate this in a way that everybody we work with also understands the importance of this. So the thinking and literature in our field has swung away from just managing children's behavior, a custodial or coercive kind of approach, to creating transformative experiences and collaborative problem solving. But how do we know that this way of working makes a positive difference? This gets to outcomes, impacts, etc. There is now a strong focus in much literature in the professions about evidence-based or evidence-informed practice. And this term actually comes from the medical profession. And I think, I don't have time to go into great detail today about this, but I think as you students particularly are reading the literature and learning, we discovered that it's not difficult to actually do a randomized controlled trial to test one drug against another drug, or a drug against no drug. To do a randomized controlled trial in residential care is almost impossible. It's certainly extremely expensive and time-consuming. To go from where we are to having an evidence-based practice takes about 12 years and at least $4 to $5 million. Now, drug companies have that money because they will make the money back 100 times over when that drug is approved. But let me just give you one example of the kind of craziness that we get into. And it's not that I'm against evidence. I'm against a really narrow definition of evidence. So, there are sleeping pills that have been approved for sale, and companies making tens of millions of dollars selling sleeping pills. And what they've proven is that people sleep 7 minutes longer a night on average. But that is statistically significant. So they're allowed to advertise it as a sleeping pill. That, to me, is the kind of bizarreness that we don't want to get into as a profession. In some of my own research, it has been the transformed lives of former children in care that have provided the best evidence of change and growth. And the stories of these young adults about what made a difference while in care, what helped them to turn their lives in a new direction towards independence and interdependence and feelings of self-worth is what really kept me focused on the need to understand the importance of residential care. It almost always, the evidence, as you know, relates to relationships and those moments of interaction. And I have lots of stories I've collected. There's not time today to tell them, but you have your own stories about what actually helped a young person turn their life around. Don Matera, I mean, I think he articulated there were some influences like the Reverend Trevor Huddleston, who gave him an image at a key moment in his life of a different way of being, right? There were many others, I'm sure. But we all have those moments. And it usually comes down to a person, doesn't it? It comes down to a relationship that we somehow internalize in a way that starts to change our way of being. Child and youth care workers work that way. So over the course of the past 40 years, there has been an evolution in how we talk about what's a good and worthy practice, what counts as evidence. And there are 4 program dimensions, which I'll just quickly mention. There are inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact. When I started in child and youth care, we wanted the government to fund us because we had good intentions. We're working hard for children and we're doing good work, so please fund us. Then people wanted us to account for outputs. But how many children do you work with? How long do you work with them? Give us, your productivity factors. So then you make your plea to government that we are very productive, so we deserve to be funded. However, neither of those work anymore. We're into an outcomes orientation and an impact generation. The outcomes are the changes that happen with families, youth, and children, such as completing high school, such as getting a job, or such as having better health outcomes, those kinds of things. So fund us because we get results is really more what the government funders and the private funders are looking for. And then impacts are generally defined as the larger level results, how those outcomes affect society and the task of nation building. And clearly, fund us because we meet relevant social goals, societal goals and priorities is something that South Africa is investing in right now, and see child and youth care as part of that. So what serves as evidence of these outcomes or impacts? What will be accepted as evidence is what can be measured. And I just wanted to say quickly that the stories of changed lives are generally dismissed as anecdotal evidence and are often disregarded as acceptable evidence of program impact. However, it is the stories of these real changes that give meaning to the numbers. And I think we need to continue to tell our stories and to articulate those, such as the Izabindi, stories from Izabindi, which I read, I devour the stories from Izabindi because they give you the heart and soul of what is behind the numbers. So what counts as evidence for funders and for government are indicators, things that can be measured. And this is part of the difficulty we have is we can give them numbers about how many people finish school or how well they did academically, but we also know that that's a rough indicator of the actual learning that happened. It's important, but so much more happens that doesn't get counted. And also the number of assaults, rapes, or abuse is evidence of whether a community is being safer or not. But we all know that the number of reports is what creates the numbers, not necessarily the reality. So that's the kind of struggle that we always have in terms of providing evidence for what we do. It's not easy to come up with the indicators that can convince people of what we do and how we do it. So I'm going to very quickly skip through this piece because what I wanted to do is just acknowledge that the research to provide evidence for residential care is still young, still early. There have been a number of articles and books trying to deal with this, and most of the conclusion is that the research is still too early to give conclusive evidence. However, there is a lot of promising practice that is beginning to emerge. And I just wanted to quickly highlight for you, Northern Ireland funded 5 pilot projects of therapeutic care, which means they provided more money for training and for staffing. And all 5 of those proved to be much superior to what they were doing before. Australia has some pilot projects going, they call it TRC, Therapeutic Residential Care. And in North America, we actually have a few dozen approaches that have developed. And the kinds of things that people are able to evaluate at this stage is not so much how the lives of children change, because I think sometimes you have to go 5 or 10 years after residential care to really know what the outcomes were. If you simply measure what happened while in care, it's very difficult to get those subtle changes evident. So what people are finding are indirect indicators, such as restraints. Some programs have had a lot of trouble controlling children's aggression, but in the middle of these 2 charts was the implementation of a therapeutic model throughout an entire agency. And on the left is how many restraints there were. And you can see they dropped by about 50%, 12 months, 18 months after a new approach was implemented. Psychotropic medication. This was not a goal of introducing good therapeutic practice, but the agency went back and tracked the use of medication across the children. They discovered that the use of medication on children dropped about 50% after they implemented a therapeutic approach. And so what that tells you is a lot of our medication is for the staff. Makes life easier for the staff. But if you know how to work in a therapeutic way, you don't need that kind of medication to control the children or to change their behavior. So much healthier, but it's a challenge. This is, I won't go through in detail, 60 or 70 restraints in a period of time. Then over time, as they implemented more and more systematic training, the number dropped. And then about 2/3 the way through that chart that you can see, they implemented a whole agency, trauma-informed, therapeutic approach, and they almost reach zero now in terms of needing to restrain. So what that tells us is the more competent and the more confident the workers are in building therapeutic relationships, the less medication is needed, the less any physical restraint is needed whatsoever. And some agencies have reached zero restraints over a year after they've done it maybe 50, 60 times a month. So really, I think what we're beginning to show is that by taking that definition of good child and youth care and training people in how to do it, things that Tom is doing, Jack Phelan's doing, all kinds of people who are here at this conference are doing all the time, it does make a difference for children. So some of the other indicators, you just look at the charts. You don't need to look at the details. Aggression towards staff, this is 3 years after the implementation, even 1 year after it started to drop. It dropped by 50%. Property destruction, runaways, all dropped by at least 50%. And just very quickly, the kind of research that's being done is comparing residential care organizations in North America to all kinds of human service organizations. So there are normative instruments that have been developed measuring different aspects of organizations. Engagement with the clients, engagement with the children. There were 29 agencies that were measured. They were in the lower levels of human service organizations. After the implementation of a therapeutic program, they were up to the average. In the functionality of the agency, they went from the bottom quarter to the top 30%. And on the stress levels, you want to go the other way. So the stress levels dropped significantly after the implementation of a therapeutic approach. So I just wanted to show you the kinds of evaluation that are being done, which I think South African programs can look at how they can use the indicators they now have to begin to demonstrate the difference in a therapeutic and trained staff. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the Izabindi project because that is an area of practice where lots of indicators are being gathered. The brilliance in that program, in part, was building in evaluation from the very start. So numbers are being collected. They're very valid indicators of what's happening to the program. Izabindi, by the way, is a whole new paradigm as far as I'm concerned. I just wanted to show you, after the Second World War, the model was to develop residential villages for children or institutions. And the children were taken out of their communities and placed in these villages. As pretty as they might have been in Switzerland, this is the Pestalozzi Children's Village, which is a model village, and lovely houses. Nevertheless, children were removed from their families and communities, and childcare workers were brought in to these artificial living situations. What's brilliant about Izabindi, of course, as you all know now, is that it brings the care work to the villages, to where the young people actually live. And committed adults are supported to respond effectively to the needs of the young people in their natural life space, their own communities. Siblings can stay together. They stay within the community that they feel comfortable in, and they're kept safe. This is a whole new paradigm for child and youth care, and I think it's the future of child and youth care work from here forward. I just list some of the things that you already know about the program. It builds on strengths within the local communities, brings knowledge and skills to the community, develops the talents and abilities of local people, many of whom stay in their communities. The trouble with a lot of the old methods was people had to go away to post-secondary education or for training, and a lot of them did not come back to their communities. That's what's happening in Canada in many cases. It creates circles of caring and wellness within the communities, and it is cost-effective and sustainable. Now, these numbers are probably way out of date because I asked for them a while ago. Jobs created, well over 3,000. I don't know what it is now, Zenny, but it's climbing every day. Citizens educated, over 4,000, and approximately 80% women. over 176,000 children. This is probably a year or so ago that these figures were collected, so it's much higher now. Educational outcomes, I'm hearing that it's reaching the national average now. I overheard Zenny talking to somebody about we're going for 80%. You know, we can hit 80% with our children. We can exceed the national average in terms of matriculation. Communities impacted, over 424 safe parks at that point. Each safe park is the energy center for a community. National goals being achieved, and of course this is, I think, in part what led to Izabindi being funded the way it is that it's achieving almost all national goals that the country has in some way. And of course all these numbers are rising. So just 3 takeaway messages I want to leave with you. Number 1, recent innovations in child and youth care are making a difference. We are now producing evidence from Izabindi, from residential research, that shows that what we're doing is making a difference, improving the quality of care for children. Secondly, I think a takeaway message is the world will soon need many more child and youth care workers. China and India are just barely beginning. Yes, applause, applause. And Africa will increasingly be in the forefront of the development of the child and youth care profession. I think what's brilliant is that it's parallel to the cell phone revolution. Many African countries did not bother to develop landlines. They didn't put up all the infrastructure for the old kind of phone system that we developed in the rest of the world. They just leapfrogged that model to cell phones. Cell phone towers and cell phones. I think Izabindi is leapfrogging the old models of child and youth care, institutions, villages, and saying, hey, we can do this in the actual villages. Brilliant, brilliant. So Africa is rising, and child and youth care is rising with it. So for all the many achievements of the NACCW, and for the impacts that all of you are having, this is the kind of venue that was used a little while ago. Let us close with a loud round of applause for the NACCW. Viva NACCW! Viva Child and Youth Care! We need Don to do this one. Viva NACCW! Viva Child and Youth Care! Thank you.
We are indeed feeling involved. We just like to thank you, and we are celebrating the 40 years as the association. And part of our achievements as an association is being part of friendship, having colleagues, and having our teachers from other countries who are here today with us. And you are one of them. We thank you very much for you being together with us, walking the journey together with us, talking the same language as we're talking in South Africa. We are happy to be part of the building of this workforce as South Africa, as the field, as NACCW. We thank you for that. And I'm happy that you're talking about putting the child at the center. And that is what we are about as child and youth care workers, as the field of child and youth care workers in South Africa, as the Association of Child and Youth Care Workers. And to be part of that as a child and youth care worker, you need to know the child, because you need to know the child. Before you know the child, you need to know yourself. And that takes developing yourself personally and professionally. And by doing that, then you know yourself. And knowing yourself takes you to knowing the child. And we understand and we are aware that to do all the work that we're supposed to do, and you mentioned that we still have a long walk in front of us to take. We need to be curious. We need to be concerned about our children in the world, in the nation, in our provinces, in our regions, in our districts, in our villages, and in our neighborhood. And we promise that we will do that. And with our government, our Department of Social Development, with us as child and youth care workers, we know and we have hope. And thank you for enriching that hope that we have in South Africa as child and youth care workers and as social services practitioners. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for choosing us. We appreciate you and we thank you. We thank you.
I'm very moved. You have a gift for thanking people.
Thank you.
I'm very moved.
Thank you very much.
You have a gift for thanking people.
Thank you.